My ex-wife and her lawyer boyfriend didn't just divorce me. They took my $10 million construction company, my home, and my dignity, leaving me to rot in a motel room with nothing but the clothes on my back. They thought I was finished. They thought I was just a useless, broken old man who would fade away into the shadows. But they forgot about one thing. A rusty, dented metal box my grandfather Jude left me in 1945. When I took the strange, heavy metal card inside to the bank, the manager turned pale. His hands shaking as he whispered, "Sir, this account has been active for 75 years. What he showed me on that screen didn't just change my life. It gave me the power to destroy the people who destroyed me." But before I tell you how I got the ultimate revenge, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps this old man share his story. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now let me tell you about the day my life ended. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It sounded like a gunshot, echoing through the cold, sterile air of the Cook County courtroom. "Judgment for the plaintiff," the judge said in a bored, monotone voice, as if he were ordering a sandwich and not dismantling a man's entire existence. I sat there frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. I looked around the room, trying to find some sense, some logic, but there was none. Just the cold, triumphant smile of Gregory Finch, the opposing counsel, or, as I now knew him, my wife's lover. Greg didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with the arrogance of a predator standing over a wounded animal. He adjusted his silk tie, the one that probably cost more than my first car, and leaned over to whisper something to Diane. My wife. The woman I had shared a bed with for 35 years. The woman I had built a life with. She giggled, actually giggled, in a courtroom where her husband was being stripped of everything. That sound broke something inside me that I didn't think could be broken. The judge continued reading the terms, his voice a drone of legal jargon that translated to one simple reality. I lost everything. King Construction, the company my father started with a single hammer and a pickup truck. The company I grew into a $10 million empire with my own sweat and blood was gone. Awarded to Diane King under the corporate restructuring agreement. The house in the suburbs, the one with the oak tree I planted when our son was born, gone. Awarded to Diane King. My retirement accounts frozen and transferred to cover legal fees. Legal fees for the man who was stealing my life. I tried to speak, to stand up and shout that this was wrong, that this was a theft, but my own lawyer, a court-appointed kid who looked like he hadn't started shaving yet, put a hand on my arm. "It is over, Mr. King," he whispered, looking at the floor. "There is nothing else we can do. The documents are binding." The documents. My mind flashed back to 2 years ago. I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart rate machine filling the room. I had suffered a minor heart attack. I was scared, vulnerable. Diane sat by my bedside, holding my hand, her eyes full of tears. Or so I thought. "Hal, honey, you need to rest," she had said, her voice trembling with concern. "You can't worry about the business right now. The doctors say stress will kill you. Just sign these papers. It puts the company in my name temporarily. Just a temporary power of attorney so I can pay the vendors and sign the payroll checks while you recover. I promise as soon as you are better, we will tear them up." I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? She was my wife. I signed. My hand was shaking from the medication, but I signed. I didn't read the fine print. I didn't see the clause that converted the temporary transfer into a permanent, irrevocable trust if 2 board members voted for it. And I certainly didn't know that the second board member was Greg Finch, the corporate attorney I had hired myself 10 years ago. I had invited the fox into the henhouse, and I had handed him the keys. Now, sitting in that courtroom, I realized the tears in the hospital were fake. The concern was an act. While I was fighting for my life, she was plotting to take it. The judge banged the gavel one last time. Case closed. Next docket. Just like that. 40 years of calloused hands, missed holidays, and 12-hour days on construction sites wiped away in 10 minutes. We walked out of the courtroom. The hallway seemed mile-long. I felt heavy, like gravity had doubled. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the harsh sunlight of the parking lot. The air smelled of exhaust and asphalt. I stopped blinking against the glare, feeling lost. Where was I supposed to go? I didn't have a home anymore. I didn't have an office. That was when I saw them. Diane and Greg were standing by my car, my silver Mercedes S-Class, the car I had bought myself as a gift for my 60th birthday. Greg was leaning against the driver's side door, twirling the keys on his finger. My keys. Diane was standing close to him. Too close. As I watched, Greg reached out and pulled her in by the waist. He kissed her, right there in the open parking lot, a deep, lingering kiss that was meant for me to see. It was a territory marker. He wasn't just taking my assets. He was taking my place. My stomach churned. I felt bile rise in my throat. I walked toward them not because I wanted to fight, but because I didn't know what else to do. My old Ford pickup truck, the work truck I kept for hauling lumber, was parked 3 spots away. It was the only vehicle the judge allowed me to keep because it had no resale value. Diane saw me approaching. She pulled away from Greg, but she didn't look ashamed. She looked empowered. She smoothed her skirt and waited for me. I stopped 5 feet away. "Why, Diane?" I asked, my voice sounding raspy and weak. "Why like this? We could have just divorced. Why did you have to destroy me?" She laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. "Oh, Hal," she said, stepping closer until I could smell her perfume. The expensive Chanel perfume I bought her for Christmas. "Divorce takes too long. And you are stubborn. You would have fought for every penny." This way was cleaner. Cleaner. I looked at Greg. He was smirking, checking his watch as if I were boring him. Besides, Diane continued leaning in, so her lips brushed my ear. Her voice dropped to a whisper, intimate and cruel. "You're an old man, Hal. You were good for mixing concrete and hammering nails, but you never had the head for business. You are outdated. A relic. Greg and I, we are the future. We are going to take King Construction global. We don't need a tired old builder holding us back. Thanks for the $10 million, though. We will make good use of it." She pulled back and patted my cheek, a gesture of condescending pity that burned my skin like acid. "Don't worry, Hal," she added loudly enough for Greg to hear. "I asked my assistant to pack up your old clothes. She will ship the cardboard boxes to your brother's place. That is all you have left anyway." Greg chuckled. "Come on, babe," he said, opening the door to my Mercedes. "I made reservations at Le Bernardin. We have a lot to celebrate." He looked at me one last time, his eyes dead and cold. "Good luck with the truck, old-timer. Try not to break down on the highway." They got into the car. The engine purred to life. I stood there, a 70-year-old man in a suit that suddenly felt too big for him, watching my wife and her lover drive away in my car with my money to celebrate the destruction of my life. I stood there until the silver car disappeared into the Chicago traffic. Then I turned and looked at the rusted Ford pickup. The bed was filled with a few plastic bags of personal items I had managed to grab from the office before the security guards escorted me out. I walked over to the truck. The handle was stiff. The door creaked when I opened it. The seat smelled of old coffee and sawdust. I sat inside and gripped the steering wheel. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I felt a cold, hard knot forming in my chest. They thought I was done. They thought I was just an old laborer who would crawl away and die. I started the engine. It sputtered and coughed, spitting black smoke, but it started. I pulled out of the parking lot, merging into the traffic, a ghost in a city I used to help build. I didn't know where I was going. I had $80 in my wallet and half a tank of gas. But as I drove, Diane's words echoed in my head. You're an old man, a relic. She was right about one thing. I was old. I was from a different time. A time when a handshake meant something. A time when you didn't kick a man when he was down. But she forgot one thing about men from my generation. We don't break easily, and we have long memories. I gripped the wheel tighter. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to make them pay. I just didn't know how yet. I drove my old pickup truck toward the industrial park with a knot in my stomach that felt like swallowed stones. It had only been 3 days since they forced me out of the company I built from the ground up, but the building already looked different to me. The familiar brick facade of King Construction, which used to swell my chest with pride every morning for 40 years, now loomed like a fortress designed to keep enemies at bay. And apparently I was the enemy. I parked in the visitor lot because my reserved spot, the one right next to the front door with my name painted on the curb, had already been painted over in a stark, impersonal black. I did not come to argue. I did not come to beg for my position back, or to make a scene in front of the employees who had looked at the floor while the board voted me out. I only wanted one thing. Under the desk in what used to be my office, there was a wooden crate. It was scratched, stained with oil and sawdust, and completely out of place in the modern glass and steel aesthetic Greg was so obsessed with. But that crate contained my father's original hand tools, the chisels he used to teach me how to shape oak, the heavy iron plane he held when he told me that integrity was the only thing a man truly owned. Those tools were the soul of this company, the foundation of everything we were, and in the chaos of being escorted out by security earlier that week, I had left them behind. I walked up to the main security turnstile, the morning sun hitting the back of my neck. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my access card. It was worn down at the edges from decades of use. I held it up to the sensor, expecting the familiar beep and the green light that had welcomed me thousands of times. Instead, the machine let out a harsh, low buzz. A red light flashed angrily. Access denied. I frowned and wiped the card on my jacket, thinking it was just a smudge or a glitch. I tried again. The same rejection. The same angry red light. It felt like a physical blow. They had not just fired me. They had erased me. I pressed the intercom button, my voice trembling slightly, despite my best efforts to sound authoritative. This is Harold King. My badge is not working. I need to get into the building to retrieve my personal effects. There was a crackle of static, and then a voice I did not recognize came through the speaker. It was cold, bored, and completely devoid of respect. Mr. King, your access privileges have been revoked effective immediately. You are not authorized on the premises. I gripped the cold steel of the turnstile. Listen to me, son. I founded this company. I am not here to cause trouble. I just need to get a box from my old office. It will take 5 minutes. Just open the gate. The voice did not soften. I cannot do that, sir. Please leave the property or I will be forced to escort you off. My blood began to boil, that old heat rising up my neck. I looked through the bars and saw 2 security guards approaching. They were not the men I knew. Old Sam, the night watchman I used to drink coffee with, was gone. These were new hires, bulky men in tactical vests who looked more like prison guards than corporate security. They walked with an aggressive swagger that told me they were enjoying this. One of them, a man with a shaved head and a face like a clenched fist, stepped up to the other side of the gate. "Sir, you need to back away. Now." I stood my ground. I am not leaving without my father's tools. Call Greg. Tell him I am here. Tell him I just want the box. The guard sighed, rolling his eyes as if I were a senile old man confused about where he lived. He swiped his own card, the gate clicked open, and before I could even step forward, he grabbed my arm. It wasn't a gentle guide. It was a hard, painful grip that dug into my bicep. He spun me around with a force that nearly knocked me off balance. I stumbled my bad knee, buckling under the sudden movement. "Hey, get your hands off me!" I shouted, the humiliation burning my cheeks. Employees were starting to gather by the lobby windows. People I had hired, people I had given Christmas bonuses to, people whose children's college tuition I had helped pay. They watched through the glass like fish in a tank, silent and detached, witnessing their former leader being manhandled like a common criminal. The guard shoved me toward the parking lot. "You are trespassing, old man. Get in your truck and go." I tried to shake him off, but he was younger and stronger. He pushed me again, and this time I fell. I hit the asphalt hard on my hands and knees. The grit of the pavement dug into my palms. My glasses slid down my nose. For a moment I just stayed there, staring at the gross stones of the pavement, trying to comprehend how my life had collapsed so completely in 72 hours. I was Harold King. I built the skyline of this city. And now I was on my knees in my own parking lot, dusting off my trousers while a stranger loomed over me. Then the automatic glass doors of the main entrance slid open with a smooth hiss. I looked up. Greg walked out. He looked immaculate in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my truck. He looked every inch the modern CEO, polished, sharp, and completely soulless. He wasn't alone. He was carrying the wooden crate. My heart leaped for a second. I thought, perhaps for a brief, foolish moment, that there was still a shred of decency in him, that he had brought it down to me, that despite his betrayal, he respected the history enough to return my father's legacy. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my knee. "Greg," I called out, taking a step forward. "I just want the tools, that is all. Just give me the box, and you will never see me again." Greg stopped about 10 feet away from me. He looked at the crate in his hands with a look of pure disdain, as if he were holding a box of rotten fruit. He ran a finger over the worn wood, sneering at the oil stains and the dents that marked years of honest labor. He looked at me, and his eyes were empty. There was no warmth, no regret, just the cold calculation of a man who had sold his soul for efficiency and profit. He did not hand the box to me. He lifted it high above his head. "No," I gasped, reaching out. "Don't." Greg smiled, a cruel, thin twisting of his lips. And then he threw it. He didn't toss it gently. He hurled it with force directly onto the hard asphalt between us. The sound was sickening. It was the sound of history shattering. The old, dry wood of the crate exploded on impact. I heard the distinct, high-pitched ring of tempered steel hitting the ground. My father's chisels scattered across the parking lot. The iron plane, the one he had held the day he died, cracked in half against the curb. I stood frozen, watching the pieces of my past skitter across the blacktop like garbage. It felt like he had thrown my father's bones onto the ground. I looked up at him, unable to breathe, unable to speak. Greg dusted off his hands, wiping away the invisible contamination of my heritage. He stepped closer, ensuring that the employees watching from the windows could see his dominance, could see that the old lion was dead and a new predator was in charge. He looked down at the wreckage of the tools and then locked eyes with me. "King Construction is a modern enterprise now," he said, his voice projecting clearly in the morning air. "We do not keep trash in the executive suite. We are clearing out the rot to make room for the future." I stared at him, my hands balling into fists at my sides. He stepped even closer, invading my personal space, his expensive cologne choking me. "Get this junk off my driveway, Harold. And then get lost before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. You are bad for our corporate image." He turned his back on me without waiting for a response. He walked back toward the glass doors, the security guards falling in step behind him, like loyal dogs. The doors hissed shut, sealing him inside the air-conditioned ivory tower I had built. I was left alone in the heat, standing over the broken remains of the only thing that mattered to me. I slowly knelt down. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I reached for the handle of the broken plane. I gathered the chisels one by one, cutting my finger on a sharp edge but not feeling the pain. I placed the pieces into the back of my truck. I did not cry. I wanted to, but the tears would not come. Instead, a cold, hard knot formed in the center of my chest. It was heavier than grief. It was colder than the steel in my hands. As I drove away, watching the building shrink in my rearview mirror, the shock began to fade, replaced by a clarity I had not felt in years. Greg thought I was trash. He thought I was weak. He thought that by breaking my tools, he had broken me. He was wrong. He had just freed me. He had just stripped away the last bit of sentimentality that might have held me back. I wasn't just a sad old man anymore. I was a man with nothing left to lose and a very specific set of skills. I knew where the bodies were buried in that company because I was the one who built the cemetery. And as I turned onto the main road, I knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. This was simply the beginning of the war. 3 months is a strange amount of time because it is long enough to forget what a silk sheet feels like, but short enough that you still reach for a light switch that isn't there in the dark. I sat on the edge of a mattress that smelled like decades of stale cigarette smoke and regret holding a styrofoam cup of instant noodles that had gone lukewarm. The neon sign outside the window buzzed with a dying flicker, casting a rhythmic, sickly red light across the stained carpet. This was the Starlight Motel, a place where people went when they had nowhere else to go, and for the last 90 days, it had been my home. I looked down at the noodles, the sodium-rich broth swirling with fake vegetables, and my stomach turned. I used to dine with mayors and architects. I used to order wines that cost more than the weekly rate of this room. Now I was rationing calories because I was down to my last $40. I finished the broth because I could not afford to waste it, and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. It was Tuesday, which meant rent was due. I grabbed my wallet, the leather cracked and worn, and pulled out my last credit card. It was the emergency card, the one with the high interest rate that I had kept in a safe for years and never touched until Diane froze the joint accounts. I walked to the front office, pulling my collar up against the damp chill of the night. The lobby smelled of bleach and cheap coffee. The owner, a man with grease under his fingernails and eyes that had seen too much misery to care about mine, did not look up from his television when I entered. I placed the card on the counter. "Room 12. I said, my voice rasping from days of silence. "Just one more week." He took the card without a word and swiped it. The machine hummed thought for a moment, and then let out a sharp, descending beep. He swiped it again. Same sound. He looked at me, then sliding the card back across the laminate counter like a bartender cutting off a drunk. "Declined," he said flatly. "Try it again," I pleaded, the desperation rising in my throat like bile. "There must be a mistake. There is at least $2,000 of credit on that." He shook his head. "It says do not honor. That means the bank killed it. You got cash." I stared at the card. It was my lifeline. It was the only thing keeping a roof over my head. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking, and opened the banking app. I logged in, praying for a glitch, a system error, anything. The screen loaded and the numbers stared back at me in stark, unforgiving black and white. My individual retirement account. The modest nest egg I had kept separate from the main fortune showed a balance of 0. There was a notification icon. I tapped it. Account frozen by court order. Pending litigation for unpaid legal fees. Diane. She hadn't just taken the house and the company shares. She was hunting down every last penny, using her high-priced lawyers to drain me dry under the guise of legal costs. She wanted me on the street. She wanted me to cease to exist. "I do not have cash," I whispered, looking up at the owner. "I can get some by tomorrow. I just need tonight." He pointed to the door. "No cash, no room. You know the rules, Harold. I have a waiting list of people who can pay. You have 10 minutes to clear your stuff out before I call the sheriff." I tried to argue, to appeal to the 3 months of timely payments, but he had already turned his back to watch his show. The finality of it was crushing. I walked back to room 12, the rain starting to fall now, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked through my thin jacket. I packed my life into 2 duffel bags in under 5 minutes. That was all I had left. 40 years of building an empire, raising a family, contributing to the community, and it all fit into the back of a rusted pickup truck. I threw the bags onto the passenger seat of my truck and climbed into the driver's side. The cab was cold, smelling of old oil and the faint lingering scent of the sawdust from my father's broken tools that were still scattered in the truck bed under a tarp. I locked the doors and leaned my head against the steering wheel. The rain drummed on the metal roof, a relentless, mocking applause. I was 70 years old. I was sleeping in a truck in the parking lot of a motel that had just evicted me. My stomach growled, a painful reminder that the noodles were not enough. I reclined the seat as far as it would go, but the steering wheel dug into my ribs. I closed my eyes, but sleep was impossible. The cold seeped into my bones, aggravating the arthritis in my hands. I watched the rain streak down the windshield, distorting the neon lights of the motel into blurry monsters. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and humiliating. I brushed it away angrily. Crying would not start the heater, not start. Crying would not put gas in the tank. I needed money. I needed just enough to buy gas to get to the next town, maybe find a day labor job where they wouldn't ask questions about my age. I sat up and turned on the dome light. I began to rummage through the glove compartment, the center console, looking for loose change, anything. I found 3 quarters and a dime. 85 cents. I turned to look at the pile of debris in the back seat and the bed of the truck. When Diane had thrown me out, she had tossed boxes of what she called my junk onto the driveway. I had shoveled them into the truck without looking. I opened the door and stepped out into the rain, moving to the truck bed. I pulled back the tarp. There were old architectural magazines, waterlogged and useless, a broken desk lamp, a box of tax returns from the 90s, and then wedged in the corner, half buried under a pile of old work boots, I saw it. It was a heavy rectangular object wrapped in an oil-stained rag. I reached for it, my fingers numb from the cold. I pulled it out and unwrapped it. It was an iron box. Not a safe, but a strong box, the kind men used 100 years ago to keep their valuables. It was rusted shut, the metal pitted and scarred by time. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to my grandfather, Jude King. He was a blacksmith, a man of iron and fire who died when I was a boy. I remembered this box sitting on the high shelf in his workshop. He had told me once that it contained his legacy, but he never opened it. When my parents died, the box came to me and I had put it in the attic and forgotten about it. Diane must have found it during her purge of the house. She would have seen the rust, felt the weight, and deemed it worthless trash, tossing it onto the pile of things to be discarded. She did not know. She did not care about history. To her, value was only what glittered. I took the box into the cab of the truck, out of the rain. I set it on my lap. It was heavy, solid. I tried the lid, but the rust had fused it shut. I looked around for something to pry it open. My eyes landed on one of my father's chisels lying on the dashboard, the one I had salvaged from the parking lot incident with Greg. The handle was cracked, but the steel was still good. I wedged the tip of the chisel into the seam of the box. I hammered the end of the chisel with the heel of my hand, ignoring the pain. Nothing happened. I hit it harder, gritting my teeth. I poured all my frustration, all my anger at Greg, at Diane, at the motel owner, into those blows. Clang, clang, clang. The sound rang out in the confined space. Suddenly, with a screech of tearing metal, the rust gave way. The lid popped open an inch. My heart hammered in my chest. I put the chisel down and pried the lid back with my fingers. The hinges groaned in protest. I opened it fully. Inside there was no gold. There were no diamonds. Diane would have laughed. But as I looked at the contents, my breath caught in my throat. It was lined with old, decaying velvet. Resting in the center was a thick, leather-bound ledger. its cover cracked and peeling. Underneath the ledger was a folded piece of parchment paper, yellow and brittle, sealed with red wax. And beside that, a heavy tarnished silver pocket watch. I picked up the ledger first. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with handwriting in faded ink. Dates, names, locations, drawings. It wasn't just a ledger. It was a journal. It was a blueprint. I turned the pages, my eyes widening. My grandfather hadn't just been a blacksmith. As I read the entries from 1920, I realized he had been an inventor. There were sketches of mechanisms I vaguely recognized, early designs for hydraulic systems that were decades ahead of their time. But it was the parchment paper that made my hands stop shaking. I broke the wax seal and unfolded it. It was a land deed, a deed from 1925. It verified the ownership of a plot of land in the mountains, a place I thought was just a family myth, a place my grandfather called the Iron Vein. And attached to the deed was a geological survey report from the same year stamped with the seal of the State Mining Commission. I squinted at the dim light to read the summary. High concentration of rare earth elements detected. Location sealed for future extraction. My grandfather had sat on a gold mine, literally, and had hidden it away, perhaps waiting for the technology to catch up, or perhaps protecting it from the very kind of people Diane and Greg had become. Diane had thrown this box away because it looked like garbage. She had thrown away the only thing that could possibly save me. She had thrown away the war chest. I closed the box and snapped the latch shut. I looked out the windshield. The rain was still falling, the motel sign was still flickering, and I was still homeless. But the despair that had been choking me 5 minutes ago was gone. In its place was a cold, burning ember of hope. I started the truck engine. The heater sputtered to life. I wasn't just an old man in a truck anymore. I was a man with a map. And come morning, I was going to find out if the Iron Vein was still there. I reached into the rusted interior of the box, my fingers trembling, not just from the cold, but from a desperate, starving hope. I was praying for silver dollars, for a stack of Depression-era banknotes, for anything that could buy a gallon of gas and a warm meal. Instead, my hand closed around damp leather and cold, unyielding metal. I pulled them out, setting them on the dashboard under the dim yellow glow of the dome light. There was no gold. There were no diamonds. My heart sank so low, it felt like it had dropped through the floorboards of the truck. It was just a book and a piece of metal. I cursed softly, the sound dying in the cold cab. I picked up the book first, picked up the Asse. It was a diary, the leather cover peeling away like dead skin, smelling of mildew and time. I opened it to the first page. The year 1945 was scrawled in the upper corner in fading blue ink. It was just Rambling's notes on weather crop yields, metal prices. Useless. I tossed the diary aside and picked up the metal object. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked, a rectangular slab of dark brushed steel that felt cold enough to burn my skin. I wiped the layer of grime away with my thumb. Words were etched deep into the surface, the engraving precise and masterful. Merchants Trust of Boston. Below that, in elegant script, Private Client Jude King, and a string of numbers that were not raised like a modern credit card but carved into the alloy. I ran my thumb over my grandfather's name. Jude King. The name brought a sudden sharp ache to my chest, piercing through the numbness of my misery. The smell of the rain and the old truck faded, replaced by the scent of coal smoke and pipe tobacco. I was 10 years old again, standing in the doorway of the forge, watching the sparks fly as Jude hammered a horseshoe. He stopped wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag that looked exactly like the one I had just unwrapped. He waved me over, his large hand resting heavily on my small shoulder. "Hal," he said, his voice like grinding stones. "You are the only one boy. Your father, your uncles, they look at the land and see dollar signs. They see timber to be cut and lots to be sold. They want the quick cash. But you look at the dirt, and you see the foundation. You know that land is the only thing that lasts. He had walked over to the shelf and patted this very iron box. I am putting this away for you, Hal. Not for a birthday, not for a wedding. This is for your rainiest day, the day when the sky falls down and the mud is up to your neck. Do not open it until the storm is breaking you. The memory faded, leaving me back in the freezing truck with the rain hammering on the roof. My rainiest day. He couldn't have known how literal that would be. I looked at the card again. Merchants Trust of Boston didn't exist anymore. I knew the history of the city. That bank had been bought out in the 70s, merged and acquired until it was just a small DNA strand in the genetic code of some massive global conglomerate. It was probably Sterling Capital, now a corporate behemoth that chewed up little people like me for breakfast. This card was a relic, a souvenir from a dead institution. It was probably worthless, a sentimental trinket from an old man who didn't trust paper money. I should have thrown it out the window. I should have curled up and tried to sleep. But starvation does strange things to a man's logic. It replaces reason with a frantic animalistic need to try every door, no matter how tightly locked it looks. I had 85 cents. I had a quarter tank of gas. And I had a piece of metal with my name, my bloodline's name on it. If it was nothing, I would die in the city instead of this parking lot. It didn't make much difference. I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life, sounding as tired as I felt. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the motel lot, leaving the flickering neon behind. The drive into the city was a blur of windshield wipers and headlights. I drove automatically, my mind blank, refusing to think about what I would do if this failed. I just focused on the road, on the rhythmic slap of the wipers, on the heat, slowly returning to my frozen feet. The city skyline rose up ahead, a mountain range of glass and steel, piercing the storm clouds. I knew where the old Merchants Trust building used to be. It was the foundation of the Sterling Capital Tower, now a 60-story obelisk of power in the financial district. I navigated the empty streets, feeling like a ghost, driving a hearse through a graveyard of wealth. I parked the truck 3 blocks away because I knew a vehicle like mine would attract security if I got too close to the entrance. I gathered my courage, tucked the heavy metal card into the pocket of my flannel shirt, and stepped out into the rain. Walking toward the building, I caught my reflection in a shop window. I looked like a vagrant. My hair was matted, my beard was gray and unkempt, and my clothes were stained with the filth of living in a vehicle. I was Harold King, the man who built half this town, and now I looked like someone who dug through its trash. Shame burned hot in my gut, but I pushed it down. I had no pride left to protect. The lobby of the Sterling Capital Tower was vast, a cathedral of marble and light. Even at this hour, it was staffed. There was a concierge desk that looked more like a judge's bench. I pushed through the revolving doors, the warmth of the building hitting me like a physical wall. The air smelled of expensive cleaning products and money. My boots squeaked loudly on the polished floor, leaving muddy footprints that seemed to scream, I did not belong here. A security guard in a suit that fit him perfectly stepped out from behind a pillar. He didn't draw a weapon, but his posture was a weapon in itself. Can I help you, sir? He asked, the word sir dripping with suspicion. He was already scanning me for threats, assessing my poverty. I stopped. I wanted to turn around and run. This was foolish. It was a delusion. But I felt the weight of the metal card against my chest, heavy and cold. It was the only thing I had. I have an account, I said, my voice sounding rough and foreign in the quiet space. I need to access it. The guard looked at me, looked at my muddy boots, and then looked toward the door. Sir, the retail branches are closed. This is the corporate headquarters. You need to come back during business hours, or find an ATM. He was dismissing me. He was seeing the homeless man, not the client. I am a private client, I said, remembering the inscription. It was a lie, or at least I thought it was. I pulled the metal card from my pocket. It caught the light of the chandelier, dull and menacing compared to the shiny plastic of the modern world. I need to speak to someone. Now. The guard frowned, looking at the piece of steel in my hand. He had never seen anything like it. He hesitated, his training conflicting with his bias. He reached for his radio, probably to call for backup to throw me out. But then a man in a dark suit walked out of the elevator bank behind the desk. He looked tired, carrying a briefcase, clearly a senior executive working late. He glanced over, annoyed by the disturbance. "What is the problem here?" he asked sharply. The guard gestured to me. "This gentleman is insisting on service, Mr. Henderson. He has some kind of old ID." I tried to hide the card, suddenly feeling foolish, but the executive, Mr. Henderson, had already seen it. He stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto the dark metal slab in my hand. He didn't look at my dirty clothes. He didn't look at my muddy boots. He looked only at the card. "Let me see that," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He walked over, ignoring the guard, and held out a manicured hand. I placed the heavy card in his palm. He held it like it was a holy relic, running his thumb over the engraving, just as I had done. He looked at the name. Jude King. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time in 3 months, someone looked at me with something other than pity or disgust. He looked at me with fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. He looked at the guard. "Clear the lobby. Close the main doors. Now." The guard blinked, confused. "Sir." "Do it." Henderson snapped, his voice echoing off the marble walls. He turned back to me, handing the card back with a reverence that made my skin crawl. He bowed his head slightly. "Mr. King, my apologies. We were not aware. We did not know the line was still active. Please, follow me. We have the vault prepared." I stood there, the rain still dripping from my coat onto their $1,000,000 floor, clutching a piece of rusted steel that my grandfather had given me for a rainy day. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what a line was, or why a modern banker would be terrified of a dead blacksmith. But as I followed him toward the private elevators, leaving my muddy footprints on his expensive carpet, I realized that my grandfather hadn't just left me a savings account. He had left me a key. And I had just unlocked a door that led to something much deeper and much darker than I could have ever imagined. The elevator doors slid open onto the 45th floor, revealing a reception area that looked more like the lobby of a 5-star hotel than a bank. The carpet was so thick it felt like walking on moss, but my boots caked with the red clay of the motel parking lot, and the grime of the city streets left distinct, shameful tracks with every step. I was acutely aware of my smell, a mix of damp wool, unwashed skin, and the stale odor of the truck cab. It hung around me like a physical cloud, an invisible barrier separating me from the pristine world of high finance. Henderson had disappeared into a back office to announce me, leaving me standing alone in front of a sleek, floating glass desk, manned by a young man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that produced arrogance. He was wearing a suit that was tailored within an inch of its life, his hair gelled into a perfect, immobile wave. He did not look up immediately. He let me stand there, dripping rainwater onto the floor, while he tapped away on a silent keyboard. It was a power move, the kind Greg liked to pull. When he finally deigned to acknowledge my existence, his eyes swept over me with a look of undisguised revulsion. He looked at my frayed collar, my grease-stained hands, and the duffel bag slung over my shoulder. He did not see a customer. He saw a security breach. "Delivery entrance is in the basement," he said, his voice clipped and dismissive, already reaching for the phone to presumably call security to have the trash taken out. "I am not a delivery man." I rasped, my voice sounding rough in the hushed acoustic perfection of the room. "I am a client." The young man let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked around the empty lobby as if performing for an audience. "Sir, this is the private wealth division. The minimum liquidity requirement to even step off that elevator is $10 million. I think you are lost. Please return to the lobby before I have you forcibly removed. My hand went to my pocket. I felt the cold, heavy weight of the steel slab. It was my anchor. It was the only thing stopping me from turning around and accepting my fate as a discarded old man. I pulled the card out. It looked dark and primitive against the bright, sterile lights of the office. I slammed it onto the glass desk. The sound was not the plastic clatter of a credit card. It was a heavy, dull thud that sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. The glass vibrated. Check the account, I commanded, channeling every ounce of authority I had left from 40 years of running job sites. The teller looked at the metal slab with a mixture of confusion and disgust. He picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. There is no magnetic strip, he sneered. There is no chip. This is just a piece of scrap metal. What are you trying to pull, old man? Just type in the numbers, I said, pointing to the string of digits engraved into the alloy. He sighed, rolling his eyes with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with a toddler. Fine. But then you are leaving. He pulled his keyboard closer and began to type the numbers, his fingers flying across the keys with practiced ease. He hit enter with a flourish, expecting a user not found message that would give him the satisfaction of kicking me out. Instead, the silence of the room was shattered by a sharp, urgent alarm from his computer. It wasn't a standard beep. It was a low, oscillating siren that seemed to come from the system's core. The screen, which had been a soft corporate blue, suddenly flashed a violent crimson. Massive white letters locked the display. Account restricted. Executive Level 1, access only. Protocol Omega. The color drained from the young man's face so fast it looked like he had been slapped. He stopped chewing his gum. He stared at the screen, his hands hovering over the keyboard, terrified to touch it again. What did you do? He whispered, his voice trembling. You hacked the system. Security. He stood up, knocking his expensive ergonomic chair backward. Before he could reach the panic button, the heavy double doors behind the desk burst open. An older man rushed out. He was not like Henderson. He was much older, his hair snow-white, walking with a cane but moving with a frantic, terrifying energy. This was Mr. Sterling, the chairman emeritus, a man whose face I had only seen in newspapers and on the plaques in the lobby. He was supposed to be retired, a figurehead, but here he was staring at the flashing red screen with wide, fearful eyes. Mr. Sterling, the young teller, stammered, pointing an accusing finger at me. This vagrant, he tried to use some fake ID and crashed the system. I was just calling the police. The old man ignored him completely. He walked around the desk, his eyes fixed not on the computer, but on the piece of dark metal lying on the glass. He reached out his hand, shaking violently, the liver spots on his skin standing out against the pale, trembling flesh. He touched the card. He ran his finger over the name, Jude King. He let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Mother of God, he whispered. It is real. He looked up at me then. He looked past the dirt, past the poverty, past the 3 months of hell I had lived through. He looked at me with a reverence that was almost religious. The original trust token. We thought it was a myth. We thought the King line was extinct. The young teller looked between us, confused and terrified. Sir, what is going on? Shut up, Jenkins. Sterling snapped a ferocity in his voice that made the young man flinch. You have no idea what you are holding. This is not a bank account. This is a compact. He turned back to me, bowing his head low, a gesture of submission I never expected to see from a master of the universe. Mr. King, I am ashamed. We did not know. We were told the line had ended with Jude. Please, forgive the reception. He gestured toward the double doors. Please, come into the inner sanctum. We have the 1920 Arabica Reserve. It is the only coffee fit for a token holder. I stood there for a moment, letting the reality shift around me. A minute ago, I was trash. Now I was royalty. I reached out and took the metal card back from the desk. The young teller watched me, his mouth hanging open, fear replacing his arrogance. I slipped the card back into my pocket. "I will take that coffee," I said quietly. Sterling ushered me through the doors past rows of gaping executives who had come out of their offices to see the source of the alarm. They looked at my muddy boots leaving tracks on their pristine carpet, but nobody said a word. They just watched with wide eyes as the chairman himself escorted the homeless man into the most secure room in the city. As the heavy doors closed behind us, shutting out the noise and the judgment of the world, I realized that the game had not just changed. The board had been flipped over entirely. I was no longer playing by their rules. I was playing by my grandfather's rules, and apparently he had written them in iron and blood. "Sit, Mr. King Sterling," said, pouring a dark aromatic liquid into a cup that looked like thin eggshell china. "We have much to discuss. The account has been dormant for 80 years. The interest alone," he paused, his hands shaking as he handed me the cup. "The interest alone is enough to buy this building. But that is not what matters. It is what is in the vault. The box was just the key, Mr. King. The token is the command, and we have been waiting a very long time for a king to give the order." I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot rich and tasted like life returning to my body. I looked at the old man. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me everything my grandfather didn't." Sterling nodded, pulled a heavy ancient key from a chain around his neck, and walked toward a wall that looked like solid mahogany, but hummed with hidden machinery. "It begins," he said, turning the key, "with the reason the Merchants' Trust was founded in the first place. It wasn't to bank money, Mr. King. It was to guard the claim. And now the claim is yours." I watched the wall slide open, revealing a steel door that looked like it belonged on a battleship. The air that drifted out smelled of ozone and old paper. My grandfather, the blacksmith who I thought just fixed plows, had hidden a secret that terrified the richest men in the city. And as I sat in that leather chair sipping the best coffee I had ever tasted, while the young man outside probably cleaned up my muddy footprints, I finally allowed myself to smile. It was a cold smile, a dangerous smile, because I knew that whatever was behind that door was going to help me burn Greg's modern enterprise to the ground. Sterling laid the heavy leather ledger onto the mahogany desk with a thud that sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. The sound echoed in the quiet, air-conditioned stillness of the private vault, dragging my attention away from the steam rising off my coffee cup. My hands were still warm from the porcelain, but my blood felt cold, a mixture of adrenaline and disbelief pulsing through my veins. I watched as the old chairman opened the book, his movements precise and reverent, like a priest handling scripture. The pages were thick vellum, yellowed at the edges, covered in the spidery, meticulous handwriting of a different era. "Mr. King, you must understand something fundamental about your grandfather," Sterling said, his voice low and raspy. "He did not trust banks. He did not trust the stock market. He lived through the crash of '29 watching men who had millions on paper jump out of windows when that paper became worthless. Jude King believed in only one thing: the earth, the dirt beneath his boots. So when he came to us in 1945, he did not create a standard savings account. He created a land trust, an irrevocable blind trust designed to withstand economic collapse, war, and the greed of his own descendants." I leaned forward, the leather of the chair creaking beneath my weight. I was still trying to process the fact that I was drinking the most expensive coffee in Boston while wearing clothes I had slept in for 3 months. I licked my dry lips and asked the question that had been burning a hole in my throat since I walked into the lobby. "How much is in it, Mr. Sterling? How much did he leave?" Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and ran a finger down a column of figures. He did not look up immediately. He seemed to be calculating, adjusting for inflation and interest in his head. Finally, he looked at me. The liquid cash balance currently available for immediate withdrawal is $2,412,000.63. The air left my lungs in a sudden sharp hiss. My vision blurred at the edges. $2.4 million. I gripped the arms of the chair so hard my knuckles turned white. A minute ago, I was calculating if I could afford a gallon of gas to get to the next town. Now I could buy the gas station. I could buy the motel that kicked me out. I could buy a house cash down tomorrow. The relief was so intense it felt like physical pain, a sudden release of the tension that had been strangling me since the day Greg threw me out of the building. I slumped back, eyes closing, tears leaking out despite my best efforts to hold them back. It was over. The poverty, the hunger, the shame. It was all over. "That is a lot of money," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It changes everything." Sterling let out a dry, short chuckle. It was a sound devoid of humor, almost dismissive. He closed the ledger and leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Mr. King, you are not listening to me. That $2 million is just the accumulated dividends. It is the passive income generated by the trust over 80 years of low-risk bond yields. It is the pocket change. It is the dust that has gathered on the furniture." I opened my eyes, staring at him. Confusion replaced the relief. Pocket change. $2 million is a fortune, Mr. Sterling. To a poor man, yes, Sterling agreed ruthlessly. But to a king, it is nothing. He stood up, his knees popping, and walked over to a flat file cabinet in the corner of the vault. He pulled open a wide drawer and retrieved a large rolled document. It was a surveyor's map drawn on linen stiff with age. He unrolled it across the desk, weighing down the corners with heavy brass ingots. "This, Mr. King, is the asset. This is the corpus of the trust. The cash is irrelevant. The real power lies here." I looked down at the map. It was a detailed topographical survey of the city from the mid-20s, but the landmarks were familiar. The river, the railway lines, the old industrial district, and right in the center, outlined in thick red ink, was a massive plot of land shaped like an anvil. Jude King purchased this land when it was nothing but swamp and scrub oak. Sterling explained, tracing the red line with a trembling finger. He saw the potential for the railway expansion. He locked this land into a fee-simple absolute ownership within the trust. "Do you know what that means, Mr. King? It means you do not just own the rights to use it. You own the soil, the rock, the air above it, and the minerals below it forever. It is the highest form of ownership in American law." I squinted at the map, trying to orient myself. The street names had changed since the 20s. The old farm roads were now highways. But the shape of the river bend was unmistakable. My eyes followed the railway line tracing the path to the industrial sector, and then I saw the address hand written in the center of the red plot. 101 Industrial Way, 50 acres. The world stopped turning. The silence in the vault became absolute, deafening ringing in my ears like a church bell. 101 Industrial Way. I knew that address better than I knew my own birthday. I had typed it onto letterheads for 40 years. I had painted it onto the side of trucks. I had driven to it every single morning at 5 a.m. since I was 25 years old. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. The room spun slowly. I looked up at Sterling, my eyes wide with shock. "That address," I choked out. "That is not just land, Mr. Sterling. That is King Construction. That is the headquarters, the fabrication plant, the lumber yard, the equipment depot. It is the entire company." Sterling nodded, a small shark-like smile playing on his lips. "Precisely, Mr. King. Your grandfather bought the land and then leased it to the operating company. The lease was a 99-year ground lease signed in 1925. The terms were incredibly generous, $1 a year, to ensure the business could grow without overhead. But the land always remained in the trust. I stood up, my legs shaking so bad I had to lean on the desk for support. Diane took the company. I whispered the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. She took the shares. She took the bank accounts. She took the brand. She took the trucks. She took everything. Sterling shook his head slowly. No, Mr. King. She took the buildings. She took the inventory. She took the business license. But she does not own the ground they stand on. She owns the house, but you own the foundation. And here is the most interesting part. He tapped a specific clause written in the margin of the map. The ground lease had a specific covenant inserted by your grandfather. A clause that states the lease is valid only so long as a direct blood descendant of Jude King maintains 51% controlling interest in the operating company. If the company is sold or if control is wrestled away from the bloodline, the lease terminates immediately. And the land, along with all improvements attached to it, reverts to the trust. I stared at the clause. The ink was faded, but the legibility was clear. Immediate reversion. It meant that the moment the board voted me out, the moment Greg signed that piece of paper taking control of the CEO position, they had inadvertently voided their right to be on the property. They were trespassing. Every truck parked in that lot, every machine in that factory, every desk in that office was sitting on land that now belonged solely and exclusively to me. Diane had spent millions on lawyers to strip me of my assets. She had forensic accountants dig through every account I ever opened. She had been so thorough, so ruthless in taking the fruit, that she never bothered to look at the roots. She thought the land was part of the company assets. She assumed it was owned by the corporation. She never checked the deed. She never checked the history because she was too busy looking at the quarterly profits. I sank back into the chair, a laugh bubbling up in my chest. It started as a low rumble and then erupted into a full, loud belly laugh that echoed off the steel walls of the vault. It was the laugh of a man who had been sentenced to death and then found the executioner's axe in his own hand. So I said, wiping tears of mirth from my eyes, let me get this straight. Greg and Diane are currently operating a multi-million-dollar enterprise on land that I own. And because they fired me, they have no lease. Correct, Sterling said, his eyes twinkling with a vicious delight. They are squatters, Mr. King. Very wealthy, very arrogant squatters. And as the sole beneficiary of the trust, you have the right to evict them. You can lock the gates. You can seize the buildings as compensation for back rent at market value. You can bulldoze the entire thing if you wish. It is your dirt. I looked at the metal card sitting on the desk, the heavy slab of steel that had saved my life. Jude King had known. He had known that men like Greg and women like Diane existed. He had known that one day the wolves would come for his family, and he had built a trapdoor that they would never see coming. He hadn't just left me money. He had left me the nuclear option. I picked up the coffee cup, my hand steady now, steady as a rock. I took a long, slow sip, savoring the taste of victory. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I think I am going to need a lawyer, not a divorce lawyer, not a corporate lawyer. I need the meanest, nastiest real estate litigator this bank has on retainer, because I am not just going to evict them. I am going to charge them rent for every second they have stood on my grandfather's soil since they betrayed me. Sterling picked up the phone on his desk, his smile widening into a grin that revealed perfectly capped teeth. Excellent choice, Mr. King. I have just the man. He eats CEOs for lunch. Shall I call him? Make the call, I said, leaning back and closing my eyes, visualizing the look on Greg's face when the locks changed. Make the call, and then order me some lunch. I have a lot of work to do. And for the first time in 3 months, I am hungry not for food, but for justice. Sterling made the call, and 20 minutes later the heavy steel door of the vault slid open again to admit a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and dressed by a tailor who served royalty. Arthur Blackwood did not walk. He glided into the room carrying a briefcase that looked thin enough to be a blade. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he gave a curt nod, took the seat next to me, and immediately pulled a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles from his breast pocket, putting them on with the deliberate slowness of a surgeon preparing to make an incision. Sterling introduced him as the bank's most aggressive asset recovery specialist, but to me he just looked like a weapon in a pinstripe suit. We laid the map and the ledger out before him, but it was a third document that Sterling retrieved from the deepest recess of the safe that caught Blackwood's attention. It was a single sheet of heavy bond paper yellowed to the color of old cream with typed text that was slightly uneven, characteristic of a manual typewriter from the mid-20th century. This was the lease agreement signed by my grandfather Jude King and my father on January 5, 1950. Blackwood ran a manicured finger down the margin of the page, his eyes scanning the legalese with a predatory intensity. He stopped at the bottom of the first page, tapped the paper twice, and then looked up at me with eyes that were chillingly devoid of warmth. "Mr. King," he said, his voice smooth and deep like aged whiskey, "are you aware of the specific temporal terms of this ground lease?" I shook my head, feeling like a schoolboy who hadn't done his homework. I assumed it was a standard 99-year lease like Sterling mentioned earlier. Blackwood allowed a very small, very cold smile to touch the corners of his mouth. "No, Mr. King. Your grandfather was far more cunning than that. A 99-year lease is standard because it effectively grants ownership rights for generations. It makes the tenant feel secure. But Jude King did not want his son or his son's company to feel secure. He wanted them to feel accountable. He set the term at exactly 75 years. I did the math in my head, staring at the date at the top of the page. January 5th, 1950. 75 years would mean. My breath caught in my throat. 1950 plus 75 is 2025. January 5th, 2025. Blackwood nodded slowly, verifying the date on his platinum wristwatch. "Today is January 8th, Mr. King. The lease expired exactly 3 days ago." I sat back in the leather chair, my mind reeling. 3 days. I had been sleeping in my truck, eating instant noodles, while the legal foundation of Greg's entire empire had quietly crumbled into dust without a single person noticing. It seemed impossible. How could they miss this? How could a billion-dollar operation miss a deadline that fatal? Blackwood seemed to read my mind. He tapped the document again. "Corporate hubris, Mr. King. It is the most common disease in my line of work. Your ex-wife Diane and her team of forensic accountants were looking for money. They were looking at the buildings, the assets, the revenue streams. When they audited the company books, they saw that the corporation paid for the construction of the headquarters. They saw the corporation paid for the machinery. The tax records showed the company owned the improvements on the land. They assumed, as most arrogant people do, that the land underneath was just a line item, a formality. They never pulled the original deed from 1925 because they assumed it had been absorbed into the company assets decades ago. They checked the fruit, but they ignored the roots. But here is the twist. Blackwood continued, turning the page to the final clause. Clause 17, subsection C. The reversion of assets. This is the kill switch, Mr. King. It states clearly that upon the expiration of the lease term, if a renewal has not been executed in writing prior to the termination date, the lease does not roll over into a month-to-month arrangement. Instead, it terminates absolutely. And here is the part that will destroy them. He began to read aloud, his voice echoing in the silent vault. Upon termination, all improvements, structures, fixtures, and equipment attached to or situated upon the demised premises shall not be removed by the tenant, but shall automatically and immediately become the sole property of the landlord without compensation to the tenant. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrified. I stared at the lawyer, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he had just said. All improvements. That meant the office building, the steel fabrication plant, the warehouses, the heavy machinery bolted to the floor, even the security gates that had locked me out. So I whispered, my voice trembling, not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming realization of power. You are saying that because they missed the deadline by 3 days, I own the buildings. Blackwood closed the folder with a snap that sounded like a gunshot. No, Mr. King. I am saying you own everything. You own the headquarters Greg is sitting in. You own the desk he is using. You own the computers his secretary is typing on. You own the $10 million CNC machines in the factory floor. Technically, you even own the coffee maker in the break room. Because they failed to renew the lease, every single physical asset attached to that 50 acres reverted to the trust 72 hours ago. They are not just trespassing on your land, Mr. King. They are operating a business inside your property, using your equipment to make money that legally should be flowing to you. I stood up and walked to the wall of the vault, staring at the rows of safe deposit boxes, but seeing only the face of my grandfather, Jude King. He had been a hard man, a man of few words, but he had possessed a foresight that bordered on prophecy. He knew that generations down the line the family might lose its way. He knew that greed might overtake the work ethic. He had built a failsafe, a mechanism to reset the board if the game became corrupted. Diane thought she had stripped me naked. She thought she had taken my legacy, my retirement, my dignity. She thought she had won because she controlled the shares and the board of directors. But she had been playing checkers while my grandfather was playing four-dimensional chess. She had stolen the car, but she didn't realize the engine belonged to me. And now the lease was up. I turned back to Blackwood and Sterling. My hands were no longer shaking. A cold calm had settled over me, the kind of calm that comes before a demolition charge is detonated. Diane and Greg. I said, my voice steady. Do not know this yet. They are probably sitting in that glass office right now, popping champagne and planning the next expansion. They think I am a broken old man rotting in a motel room. Blackwood smiled, and this time it was a genuine smile, a predator recognizing another alpha. They have absolutely no idea, Mr. King. As far as the county recorder is concerned, the title transfer was automatic the moment the clock struck midnight on the 5th. The paperwork is already in the archives. They just haven't received the notification yet. I walked back to the table and placed my hand on the rusted iron box. It was cold, rough, and real. It was the only honest thing in a world of lies. I want to go there, I said. I want to go to 101 Industrial Way. But I do not want to go as a beggar. I do not want to go as a trespasser. I want to go as the landlord. Blackwood stood up, smoothing his jacket. I will have the eviction notice drafted within the hour. We will need a police escort given the value of the assets involved. But Mr. King, we are not just going to evict them. We are going to lock down the facility. We are going to freeze operations. The moment we serve this paper, every activity on that site becomes theft of your property. We can shut down the power. We can chain the gates. We can have Greg arrested if he tries to take so much as a stapler out of the building. Do it, I said. The memory of Greg throwing my father's tools onto the asphalt flashed through my mind. The sound of the wood cracking. The look of sneering contempt on his face. He had called me trash. He had said he was clearing out the rot well. He was right about one thing. It was time to take out the trash. Get the police, I told Blackwood. Get the biggest, toughest sheriff deputies you can find. And get a locksmith. I want the locks changed on every door before sunset. And one more thing. I looked at the young teller who was still watching from the glass wall outside, his face pale with curiosity. Get me a suit. I cannot evict my son looking like this. I need to look like the man who owns the ground he walks on. Sterling nodded, reaching for the phone. Consider it done, Mr. King. The tailors on the 3rd floor will be ready for you in 5 minutes. As I walked out of the vault, leaving the iron box and the millions of dollars behind me, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't joy. It was the heavy, grim satisfaction of the hammer coming down to meet the anvil. The storm my grandfather had predicted had finally come, and I was the lightning. I walked out of the bank with a cashier's check for $50,000 tucked into my jacket pocket, leaving the rest of the $2.4 million sitting securely in the new trust account, ready to be deployed like ammunition in a war chest. I did not go back to the motel to gather my meager belongings, and I did not go to a car dealership to replace my rusted truck. Instead, I drove straight to the glass monolith in the city center where Simon Ford held court. Simon was not just a lawyer, he was a shark in a three-piece suit, a legal predator who had spent the last decade terrorizing corporate boards and destroying careless executives. More importantly, he hated Greg with a passion that bordered on obsession ever since 3 years ago at a charity gala when Greg had drunkenly insulted Simon, calling him an ambulance chaser, in front of the city's elite, and Simon never forgot a slight. The receptionist at the law firm looked at my stained clothes and matted hair, with disdain, her hand hovering over the security button, but I simply placed the check on the marble counter and told her it was a retainer for 10 minutes of Mr. Ford's time. Curiosity overcame her prejudice, and 5 minutes later, the double doors swung open. Simon Ford stood there, impeccable and sharp, his eyes scanning me not with judgment, but with calculation. "Harold King," he said, his voice dry and amused. "I heard you were sleeping in your car. Rumors travel fast in this town." I stood tall, meeting his gaze. "I was. But things have changed. I need to hire you, Simon, and I need to know if you still hold a grudge against my son." Simon smiled, a slow, dangerous stretching of lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Hate is a strong word, Harold. I prefer to think of him as a target. Rich environment come in." We walked into his office, a corner suite that smelled of leather and expensive scotch, and I laid everything out on his obsidian desk, the trust deed from 1945, the expired ground lease, the survey map, and the bank statements showing the frozen assets. Simon put on his reading glasses and began to read. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of paper. I watched his face closely, waiting for the dismissal, waiting for him to tell me I was crazy, but instead his eyebrows raised. He flipped back to the first page, checking the dates, then checked the signatures, and suddenly Simon Ford threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud barking sound that startled his assistant outside. "Oh my God," he wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "This is beautiful, Harold. This is absolute poetry. Greg thinks he is a genius. He thinks he is the master of the universe because he stole the operating company. But he forgot the most basic lesson of real estate: dirt rules everything." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with predatory intent. "Listen to me, Hal. We are not just going to take the company back. Taking it back is too easy. We are going to make them bleed. We are going to make them vomit up every single dime they have stolen from you, and then we are going to garnish their future earnings until they are old and gray. Greg is sitting in a building that legally belongs to you. Every product he manufactures is being made on your property. Without a lease, every dollar of revenue he generates is technically the fruit of a poisonous tree. We can freeze their accounts tomorrow. We can padlock the doors by noon." I shook my head slowly, raising a hand to stop his momentum. "No, Simon, not yet. I don't want to serve them the eviction notice today." Simon frowned, confused, looking at the documents again. "Why wait? Every day they are. There is an insult every day they breathe. Your air is a theft. Because I said, my voice low and steady, I know something they don't know. I still have friends in the office. Old loyalties die hard. My former secretary called me yesterday from a burner phone because she was terrified of being overheard. Diane is in final negotiations to sell King Construction. She is talking to a conglomerate from Zurich. They are offering $80 million for the brand. The assets and the facilities. They are due to sign the letter of intent next week." Simon went still. He processed this information, his mind racing through the legal implications like a computer calculating a chess move. If they are selling, he whispered, then they have to provide a warranty of title. They have to legally swear in the contract that they own the assets they are selling, including the headquarters and the factory. I nodded exactly. If we strike now, we just stop the sale. They get embarrassed. Maybe they lose the deal, but they survive. But if we wait... Simon finished the sentence for me, a wicked grin spreading across his face. If we wait until they sign the preliminary agreement. If we wait until they accept the deposit. If we wait until they represent to a multinational corporation that they own the land. Then it isn't just a property dispute anymore. It is criminal fraud. It is breach of contract on a massive scale. The buyers will sue them into oblivion. We won't just take the company, we will leave them facing prison time and bankruptcy that spans generations. You are a cold man, Harold King, Simon said, looking at me with newfound respect, and I like it. He extended his hand across the desk. We wait. We let them think they have won the lottery. We let them pop the champagne. We let them sign their names on the dotted line, and the moment the ink is dry, we drop the hammer. I shook his hand, the grip was firm, and the deal was done. I walked out of his office into the bustling city street, feeling the cold wind on my face, but feeling no chill. I was no longer just a victim. I was a hunter lying in the tall grass, waiting for the prey to expose its throat. Greg and Diane wanted to sell my legacy. Fine, I would let them sell it, and then I would show up to collect the check, the keys, and their dignity. The executive suite of King Construction sat high above the sprawling lumber yard, illuminated by the soft amber glow of recessed lighting that Greg had installed the week after I was escorted from the premises. Inside that glass-walled office, the air was cool and smelled of expensive lilies and the crisp ozone scent of money. From where I sat 3 blocks away in the darkened cabin of a rental sedan, I could not hear them. But thanks to my loyal former secretary who had left her phone line open on the desk, I could hear every clink of crystal and every word of their celebration. They were drinking vintage champagne, the kind that costs $300 a bottle. I listened to the pop of the cork and the fizzy rush of the pour. They were celebrating the end of my legacy and the beginning of their life of leisure. Greg was standing by the window looking down at the empire he had stolen. I could hear the smugness in his voice, a thick, oily tone that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Can you believe it, Mother?" he asked. $15 million. The Zurich Group didn't even blink at the valuation. We are going to be liquid by the weekend. I heard Diane laugh, a sound like breaking glass, sharp and cold. "I told you, Greg," she said. "Your father never understood the value of what he was sitting on. He treated this place like a sandbox, playing with his tools and his wood. He was too sentimental to see the gold mine. We are finally extracting the value he was too weak to touch." They clinked their glasses, the sound ringing out clearly over the speaker. They talked about the future with a terrifying casualness. They discussed the private jet they had chartered for Friday afternoon, immediately following the signing ceremony. They talked about a chateau outside of Paris that Diane had been eyeing for months. They carved up the carcass of my life's work and planned how to spend the meat. They spoke of me only in the past tense, as if I were a ghost or a footnote in a history book they had already closed and shelved. Amidst this atmosphere of premature victory, the afternoon mail arrived. It was not delivered with fanfare. It was simply placed in the inbox by an intern who wanted to get out of that room as fast as possible. Buried beneath trade magazines and utility bills was a single cream-colored envelope. It did not look like a threat. It looked like the most boring piece of administrative paperwork imaginable. This was Simon Ford's genius. He knew that men like Greg did not fear lawsuits because they thought they could outspend them, but they ignored bureaucracy because they thought they were above it. I heard the rustle of paper as Greg picked up the stack. He was flipping through it with the casual disdain of a man who believes he is about to leave all these mundane concerns behind. He stopped at the cream envelope. I held my breath. This was the moment. If he handed it to the legal department, if he actually read the fine print, he might see the trap. He might see that it was a formal request to update the beneficiary information for the land trust that owned the ground beneath his feet. "What is it?" Diane asked, her voice bored. Greg tore the envelope open. I could hear the rip of the paper. "To Mo." He scanned the document. It was a masterpiece of dull legal formatting, asking for confirmation of the current landlord for property tax assessment purposes. Nothing screams ignore me like a tax assessment update. "Nothing," Greg said, his voice dismissive. "Just some city administrative nonsense. They want to update the property records for the tax rolls, probably fishing for a fee increase or checking zoning compliance. It is irrelevant." He didn't read the parcel number. He didn't check the name on the deed. He didn't pause to wonder why the city was asking who the landlord was if the company supposedly owned the building. His arrogance acted as a blinder, narrowing his vision until he could only see the $15 million check waiting for him on Friday. I heard the distinct dry crunch of paper being crumpled into a ball. He didn't file it. He didn't put it in the tray for the secretary. He walked over to the wastebasket, the stainless steel bin that sat right where my old oak bucket used to be, and he dropped the ball of paper. "Garbage," he muttered. "It is all garbage. Who cares about property taxes? By the time the city processes that form, we will be in Paris, and this place will be Zurich's problem. Let the new owners deal with the red tape. We are done with this dirt." Diane giggled, the champagne clearly going to her head. "To Paris," she said. "To the future. And to getting what we deserve." Greg joined the toast. "To getting exactly what we deserve." I reached out and ended the call sitting back in the darkness of the car. A cold smile spread across my face. They were right. They were going to get exactly what they deserved. They had just thrown away their only warning. They had held the truth in their hands and discarded it because it looked like work. They were standing on a trapdoor, and with that toss of the paper, Greg had just greased the hinges. They thought they were selling a company, but they were about to commit felony fraud on an international scale. Friday was coming, and when they picked up the pen to sign that contract, they wouldn't be signing a sale. They would be signing their confession. I started the car and drove away, leaving them to their champagne. Let them drink, let them celebrate, because the hangover was going to be biblical. The silence in the executive boardroom was so profound that I could hear the microscopic scratch of the gold nib of Greg's Montblanc pen as it hovered over the signature line. The air conditioning hummed a low, expensive note, circulating the scent of fresh orchids and the terrified sweat of anticipation. Diane sat next to him, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her eyes fixed on the check that lay in the center of the spread like a religious offering. Across from them, the three representatives from the Zurich Global Corp sat like stone statues, their faces impassive, their suits impeccable, waiting to acquire the legacy I had built with blood and sweat for a fraction of its true worth. They thought they were buying a construction empire. They had no idea they were about to buy a crime scene. I waited until the pen touched the paper. I wanted the ink to flow. I wanted the intent to be undeniable. Then I pushed the double doors open. I did not kick them. I did not shout. I simply applied steady, irresistible pressure and walked into the room. The heavy oak doors swung inward with a majestic groan that shattered the quiet concentration of the deal. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. For a second, nobody moved. They were looking for the homeless man they had thrown out 3 months ago. They were looking for the broken creature in the stained flannel shirt and the muddy boots. But that man was dead. In his place stood Harold King, wearing a charcoal gray bespoke suit that cost more than Greg's car, my shoes polished to a mirror shine my beard, trimmed to a sharp, authoritative line. I walked with the easy, heavy grace of a man who knows he owns the floorboards beneath his feet. Flanking me were Simon Ford carrying a briefcase that looked like a weapon and 2 uniformed U.S. Marshals. their hands resting casually on their belts, their faces grim and unamused. Greg was the first to react, his arrogance overriding his confusion. He stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward, crashing onto the floor. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his face flushing a violent, ugly red. "Security! Where is security? Get this old man out of here." He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes bulging. "You are trespassing, Harold. I told you if you came back here, I would have you arrested. Get out before I call the police." I did not stop walking. I did not even look at him. I walked straight to the empty chair at the head of the table, the seat that used to be mine, and I pulled it out. The Swiss bankers looked from Greg to me, their professional masks slipping just enough to reveal confusion. "Who is this, the lead negotiator?" asked, his accent thick and sharp. Simon stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor blade through silk. "Gentlemen, please do not let us interrupt your transaction. But before you purchase this shell, my client thought you might be interested to know who owns the meat inside." Greg slammed his hand on the table. "This is harassment. This man has no standing here. He was removed from the board 3 months ago. He owns nothing. He is destitute. Sign the papers. Let's finish this, and I will deal with him." The Swiss banker hesitated, his pen hovering inches from the document. He looked at me, taking in the suit, the marshals, the calm certainty in my eyes. He capped his pen. "I think we will hear what the gentleman has to say," he said softly. "Due diligence is never a waste of time." Simon opened his briefcase and slid a single document across the polished wood. It glided over the surface and came to rest directly in front of the lead buyer. It wasn't the eviction notice. It was the title deed. The new one. "The one filed 3 days ago, Greg. You always claimed to be a student of the law," Simon said, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "But you forgot the first rule of real estate. Improvements follow the land." He pointed to the document. "You are trying to sell a building, a factory, and $20 million worth of heavy machinery. That is very ambitious. The problem is you don't own them." Diane stood up, then her face pale as a sheet. "That is a lie," she hissed. "The corporation owns the assets. We have the tax records. We have the depreciation schedules. We built those buildings." Simon smiled, and it was the terrifying smile of a shark scenting blood in the water. "Yes, you did. You built them on land you leased. A lease that expired last Tuesday. And because you were too busy planning your vacation to Paris to read the original 1950 ground lease, you missed the reversion clause." He leaned over the table, getting right in Greg's face. "When the lease died, everything attached to the dirt became the sole property of the landlord." He pointed a finger at me. "Meet the landlord." I watched the realization hit them. It wasn't immediate. It was a slow, creeping horror. Greg looked at the paper. He looked at the clause Simon had highlighted. He looked at the date. I saw his eyes dart to the window, looking at the sprawling complex outside the warehouses, the trucks, the cranes. He had thought they were his. He had thought he was a king. And in the span of 10 seconds, he realized he was just a squatter in a very expensive suit. The Swiss banker picked up the deed. He read it once. He read it twice. Then he looked at Greg with a cold, hard stare that could freeze water. "You represented in the warranty of title that the company owned these assets fee simple," he said, his voice quiet and dangerous. "You swore in this contract that there were no encumbrances." "It is a technicality," Greg stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "We can fix it. We can renew the lease. It is just paperwork." "It is fraud," the banker said, standing up and gathering his papers. "It is a material misrepresentation of assets. You tried to sell us property you do not own." I spoke then for the first time. My voice was low, gravelly, and filled with the weight of 40 years of labor. "There will be no renewal," I said. "The lease is terminated. The eviction notice is effective immediately." I nodded to the marshals. One of them stepped forward and placed a heavy folded document on top of the unsigned contract. "This is a court order for immediate possession," the the marshal said, his voice booming in the silent room. All operations are suspended. The premises are to be vacated by all unauthorized personnel forthwith. Mr. Gregory King and Mrs. Diane King, you are to surrender all keys, access cards, and company devices immediately. You are to leave the property. If you refuse, you will be removed in handcuffs. Diane sank back into her chair, looking as if she had been shot. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked at the check on the table, the $15 million that was supposed to be her ticket to a new life. It was just a piece of paper now. Worthless. Greg looked at me, his eyes filled with tears of rage and humiliation. You can't do this, he whispered. I am the CEO. This is my company. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. No, son, I said. It was never your company. It was a stewardship. And you failed. You treated the land like dirt, and now the dirt has buried you. The Swiss bankers were already packing their briefcases, looking at Greg and Diane with absolute disgust. They didn't even say goodbye. They just walked out, stepping around the stunned executives, leaving the contract unsigned and the champagne warm and unopened. I looked at Simon. Escort them out, I said. And Simon, make sure they don't take anything. Not a laptop, not a file, not a pen. If it is in this building, it belongs to me. Greg lunged for the check on the table, a desperate animalistic grab for the last scrap of his dream. But the marshal was faster. He caught Greg's wrist in midair, twisting it behind his back with practiced ease. That is enough, the marshal said. You are leaving now. I walked to the window and looked out at the yard. I saw the workers stopping their machines as the news spread. I saw the security guards at the gate reading the new orders. I saw my empire, my father's legacy, returning to me. Behind me, I heard the sounds of Greg and Diane being marched out of their own boardroom. I heard Diane sobbing a jagged, ugly sound. I heard Greg shouting threats that sounded hollow and pathetic. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see them go. I just watched the sun glinting off the metal roof of the fabrication plant, shining on the wet asphalt, where my father's tools had been broken. They were gone. The rot had been cut out. The wound would leave a scar, yes, but the body would survive. And as the door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the silence of the office that was finally mine again, I took a deep breath. The air didn't smell like expensive lilies anymore. It smelled like work, and it was the sweetest smell in the world. Simon stepped forward into the vacuum of silence left by the marshal's declaration, and he did not need to shout, because he commanded the room with the lethal precision of an executioner who enjoys his work. He placed a single document on the center of the mahogany table, directly between the terrified gaze of my ex-wife and the confused frown of the lead Swiss investor. The paper made a soft, crisp sound against the polished wood, a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness of the boardroom. It was not a lawsuit, and it was not a threat. It was a simple, single-page certification of property title stamped with the official seal of the county recorder, dated exactly 3 days ago. Gentleman, Simon began, his voice smooth as silk but sharp as a razor, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. I believe there has been a fundamental and perhaps criminal misunderstanding regarding the inventory of this sale. You are under the impression that you are purchasing a fully operational construction empire, complete with a concrete batch plant, a steel fabrication facility, and a logistics hub. You believe you are buying the physical means of production. He paused, allowing the words to hang in the air, while Greg made a small, strangled noise in the back of his throat like a dying animal. However, Simon continued, tapping the document with one manicured finger. The reality is quite different. The ground lease for this property expired last Tuesday at midnight. Under the reversion clause of the original 1950 deed, which my client's grandfather wrote with incredible foresight, all improvements attached to the land became the sole property of the landlord the moment the clock struck 12. The lead Swiss negotiator picked up the document, his eyes scanning the legalese with the speed of a machine. His face, which had been impassive and professional, slowly drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked up at Greg, and the look in his eyes was no longer one of a business partner, but of a man realizing he has walked into a trap. Simon smiled, and it was a cold, terrifying thing to witness. Mr. Weber, let me be very clear about what this means. The 90,000 square foot office building we are standing in belongs to Harold King. The heavy machinery bolted to the factory floor belongs to Harold King. The 3 tower cranes in the south yard belong to Harold King. Even the copper wiring inside these walls and the glass in these windows belongs to Harold King. The entity you are currently negotiating with, King Construction Incorporated, owns nothing but the laptops on these desks, the ergonomic chairs you are sitting on, and perhaps the staplers in the supply closet. You are offering $15 million for a shell corporation that effectively owns office supplies. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb having detonated, but the shockwave not yet hitting. Diane let out a sob, a sharp, jagged sound that broke the spell. She looked at the check sitting on the table, the check that represented her Paris chateau, her new life, her freedom, and she reached for it, her hand trembling violently. But the Swiss banker moved faster. Mr. Weber stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He did not look at the document anymore. He looked at Greg, and his expression was one of pure, unadulterated fury. He reached out and snatched the memorandum of understanding, the preliminary contract that they had spent 6 months negotiating. "You attempted to sell us assets you do not possess," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. His accent was thick now, heavy with disgust. "This is not a business transaction. This is a swindle. You brought us here. You wasted our time, and you attempted to defraud Global Corp of $15 million by selling us property that legally belongs to another man." Greg stammered, sweat pouring down his face, ruining his expensive collar. "No, please, listen. It is a technicality. We can fix it. We can negotiate a lease renewal my father will listen to. Reason he just wants more money. We can pay him rent." "There will be no rent," I said, my voice low and final from the head of the table. "I am not leasing this land to you, Greg. Not for $1 million a month. I am taking it back." The banker looked at me and gave a short, sharp nod of respect, the kind one professional gives another when a game has been played and won decisively. Then he turned back to the papers in his hand. He did not just set them down. He took the contract, the memorandum, the entire stack of lies Greg and Diane had built their future on, and he tore it in half. The sound of the ripping paper was louder than a gunshot in that room. He tore it again and again, dropping the confetti-like pieces onto the table right next to the unopened bottle of champagne. "The deal is terminated," Mr. Weber said, turning his back on them. "Our legal team will be in contact regarding the breach of good faith and the expenses we have incurred during this due diligence. Do not contact us again." He signaled to his team, and the 3 men in suits gathered their briefcases with military precision. They marched out of the room, stepping over the scattered pieces of the contract, not even glancing at the sobbing woman or the pale, shaking man who had tried to play them for fools. The door clicked shut behind them, and the sound was final. The $15 million was gone. The chateau in Paris was gone. The private jet was gone. All that was left was the reality of the situation. Diane stared at the shredded paper on the table, her eyes wide and vacant, as if she could not comprehend that the money had evaporated into thin air. Greg slumped into his chair, his head in his hands, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked small. He looked like a child who had broken a valuable vase and knew there was no way to hide the pieces. Simon walked over to the table and picked up the bottle of vintage champagne. He looked at the label appreciatively. "It would be a shame to waste this," he said, his voice conversational and light. "After all, it belongs to the landlord now, along with the table it is sitting on." I looked at my son and my ex-wife. I expected to feel triumph. I expected to feel a surge of joy at their total destruction. But all I felt was a deep, weary hollowness. They had sold their souls for this deal. They had thrown me away like garbage for this check, and now they had nothing. They were trespassers in a building they thought they owned, sitting on chairs that belonged to the man they despised, staring at the ruins of a future they had stolen but could not keep. "You have 10 minutes, I said, my voice cutting through Diane's weeping. "The marshals will escort you to your cars. You will take nothing but your personal effects. No hard drives, no files, no company phones. Leave the keys on the table." Greg looked up, and his eyes red and rimmed with desperation. "Dad, please," he whispered. "Where are we supposed to go? We sold the house to pay the lawyers. We put everything into this deal. We have nothing." I looked at him and I saw the reflection of myself 3 months ago, standing in the rain in the parking lot begging for my tools. I saw the man who had slept in a truck and eaten instant noodles while they drank wine, and laughed at my misery. "You are resourceful people," I said, echoing the words he had said to me when he kicked me out. "I am sure you will figure something out. The Starlight Motel has reasonable weekly rates. Just make sure you have cash. They do not take credit." I turned and walked toward the window, looking out at the empire that was mine again. I heard the marshals stepping forward, the jingle of handcuffs, just in case things got difficult. I heard Simon popping the cork of the champagne. But I did not turn around. The lesson was over. The war was won. And now it was time to clean up the mess. The room was silent, but it was not empty of sound. It was filled with the frantic, desperate breathing of two people watching their lives disintegrate. In real time, Greg did not look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a cornered animal searching for an exit that did not exist. He smoothed his tie with trembling hands and forced a look of defiance onto his face, a mask that slipped every few seconds to reveal the terror underneath. He turned to Simon, his voice pitching high and thin, attempting to summon the legal arrogance that had served him so well in the past when he was bullying subcontractors and firing employees. "You cannot do this," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the lease document. "This is unjust enrichment. It is equitable estoppel. We have made millions of dollars in improvements to this property. The law protects tenants from this kind of predatory seizure. We will sue. We will tie this up in court for 10 years. You will never see a dime of rent, because we will file an full injunction. Tomorrow morning, this is adverse possession. We have occupied this land openly for decades." Simon did not even blink. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Greg with the kind of pity one might show a toddler trying to explain quantum physics. "Greg, please stop embarrassing yourself. You are throwing around legal terms. You learned in a semester of business law, but you do not understand what they mean. Adverse possession does not apply when there is a valid lease in place. You were here with permission until 3 days ago. And as for unjust enrichment," Simon tapped the yellowed paper of the 1950 agreement. "This is a contract signed by your grandfather and your father. It is ironclad. It explicitly waives any right to compensation for improvements. It states clearly in plain English that you built those factories at your own risk." Simon leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want to sue? Go ahead. But remember, Greg, you are suing the landlord while trespassing on his property. Every day you stay here without a lease, damages accrue. And since you just admitted you made millions in improvements, you have established the value of the property yourself, which means the bond for your injunction will be astronomical. You cannot afford to fight us. You cannot even afford to pay your own lawyers to read this document." Diane let out a low moan, her head in her hands. Greg looked at her, then back at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy. "He had never shown me, Dad." He whispered the word, sounding foreign in his mouth. "Dad, you cannot let him do this. We built this company. I am your son. This is my life." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had thrown my father's tools onto the asphalt. The man who had changed the locks and erased my name from the parking spot. The man who had called me trash. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt a cold, heavy clarity. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket. I walked to the window and looked out at the empire of steel and concrete below. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining on the cranes. The trucks were lining up at the weigh station. It was a machine that printed money, and for the last 3 months, they had been feeding it with my blood. I'm not a monster. Greg. I said, turning back to face them. My voice was calm, steady, and reasonable. I am not going to throw you out into the street like you did to me. I am a businessman, and this is a business transaction. Greg looked up, hope sparking in his eyes, fierce and desperate. You mean we can stay? I nodded slowly. I am willing to offer you a new lease. I believe in giving people a second chance, so here is the offer. You can keep the building. You can keep the machines. You can keep your office and your title and your little kingdom. Diane looked up, mascara running down her cheeks, really. Harold, you would do that? I smiled a thin, tight smile. Of course, but the terms have changed. The $1 a year lease was a gift from my grandfather to his son. It was a subsidy for family, but you made it very clear 3 months ago that I am no longer family. You said I was bad for the corporate image, so we will treat this as an arm's-length commercial transaction. I turned to Simon, giving him the signal. Simon opened a folder and pulled out a fresh, crisp document, laying it on the table next to the ruins of their sale. Based on the current market valuation of the land, the 50,000 square feet of office space, the industrial zoning, and the exclusive rail access, Simon said. Reading from the paper, the fair market rent for this facility is substantial. We have assessed similar properties in the industrial park. I looked directly at Greg, locking eyes with him. The new rent is $500,000 a month. Triple net, you pay taxes, insurance, and maintenance. $500,000, Greg. His jaw dropped. That is insane. That is $6 million a year. We cannot afford that. Our margins are thin. I shrugged. Then you should have managed the company better. Or maybe you should not have spent so much on corporate jets and vintage champagne. But that is the price. Take it or leave it. There was a long silence. Greg looked at Diane, doing mental math, trying to see a way out. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was thinking about the cash flow, about robbing Peter to pay Paul, about floating the cost until the next big contract came in. Fine, he said, his voice tight. We will pay it. We accept $500,000 a month. Send us the invoice. We will pay at the end of the month. And I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. No, Greg, I said, shaking my head. That is not how it works. You have bad credit. You are a high-risk tenant. You just lost your biggest buyer. You are desperate. So the terms are non-negotiable. I leaned over the table, placing my hands flat on the mahogany. First month last month, and a security deposit equal to 4 months of rent, payable immediately via wire transfer or certified check. That is $3 million, Greg, due today, before the sun goes down. $3 million. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Greg went white. He looked at Diane, and for the first time I saw genuine terror in his eyes. He turned to his mother, expecting her to pull out a checkbook, expecting her to have a secret account, expecting the magic money fairy to save them again. Diane, he said, his voice shaking. Mom, pay him. Write the check. We can fix this later. Just pay him the $3 million. Diane did not move. She sat frozen in her chair, her hands clutching her designer bag. She did not look at Greg. She did not look at me. She looked at the wall, her eyes wide and vacant. Diane, Greg shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Pay him. We have the reserves. We have the acquisition war chest. Write the check. Diane made a small, choking sound. I can't, she whispered. What do you mean you can't? Greg screamed. We had $4 million in the operating account last month. Where is it? Diane looked at him, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. I spent it, Greg. I spent it on the lawyers to fight your father. I spent it on the deposit for the chateau in France. I spent it on the jet charter. I transferred it to the offshore account to hide it from the IRS, and the freeze order blocked it. The operating account is empty. Greg, we have nothing. We are overdrawn. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. Greg stared at his mother, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They were not just beaten, they were broke. They had hollowed out the company to pay for their arrogance. And now that the bill had come due, they had nothing but empty pockets and a mountain of debt. I looked at them and I felt the final weight lift from my shoulders. It was done. They had destroyed themselves. I did not need to lift a finger. I just had to present the bill. So I said, my voice soft and final. It seems we have a problem. You cannot meet the terms of the lease, which means you are trespassing. I nodded to the marshal's gentleman. Please escort these individuals off my property. They are to be removed immediately. If they resist, arrest them for criminal trespass, and Simon have the locks changed fast. Greg lunged across the table, a scream of pure animal rage tearing from his throat. You ruined me, he shrieked. You planned this. You old bastard. You planned this. The marshal caught him mid-air, slamming him down onto the expensive carpet. Handcuffs clicked tight, pure and metallic. Snapping shut on his wrists, Greg thrashed and screamed, cursing me, cursing the world, but the marshal hauled him up like a sack of flour and dragged him toward the door. Diane stood up, shakily sobbing uncontrollably. She looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a toxic mix of hatred and regret. Harold, please, she begged. Don't do this. We have nowhere to go. I looked at her, cold and unmoved. I gave you the address of the motel, Diane. I suggest you hurry. They fill up fast when it rains and take your champagne. It is the last thing you will ever drink on my dime. I watched them go, dragged out of the office they had stolen, leaving behind the silence of the room and the company that was finally truly mine. I walked to the head of the table and sat down. I picked up the phone. Get me the foreman, I said to the empty room, speaking to the ghost of the loyalty I used to have. Tell the crew to get back to work. We have a company to run, and tell them the king is back. The chaos in the boardroom spilled out into the parking lot, like an infection draining from a wound finally lanced. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the asphalt where my father's tools had been broken 3 months ago. But the darkness that was falling on Greg and Diane was entirely of their own making. As the marshals marched them toward their vehicles, the facade of their unity crumbled completely. Greg did not look at his mother with concern or shared grief. He looked at her with the frantic eyes of a rat, realizing the ship was not just sinking, but on fire. He suddenly stopped, twisting violently against the grip of the officers, and screamed. It was not a scream of sorrow. It was an accusation. It was her idea, he shrieked, spitting the words at the woman who had birthed him and conspired with him. She told me to do it. She told me to cook the books. She set up the offshore accounts. I was just doing what she said. I am innocent. She is the one who wanted the chateau. Diane stopped walking. She looked at her son, the boy she had spoiled, the man she had corrupted, and her face crumpled, not in sadness, but in absolute horror. She realized in that moment that she had raised a monster who would feed on her to survive another minute. But Greg's betrayal was futile. As he tried to lunge toward his sports car, screaming about a hidden laptop and a flight to the Cayman Islands, a second squad car pulled up with its lights flashing silently. It wasn't the local police. It was the State Financial Crimes Division. My forensic accountant, the man Greg had fired and I had secretly rehired, had done his work well. He had found the black fund, the secret embezzlement scheme Greg had been running behind even Diane's back. Greg hadn't just been spending company money, he had been stealing the payroll taxes and the pension contributions. He wasn't just bankrupt, he was a felon. I watched from the main entrance as they read him his rights. The handcuffs went on, and for the first time Greg stopped screaming. He slumped against the squad car, his eyes dead, realizing that there was no lawyer expensive enough and no lie clever enough to talk his way out of federal embezzlement charges. They put him in the back of the car, and he didn't even look back at the empire he had briefly stolen. Diane was left standing on the curb. The marshals had released her as she wasn't under arrest yet, but she had nowhere to go. Her car had been seized as a company asset. Her home was sold. Her lover, the Swiss banker, had left hours ago. She stood there in her expensive suit, holding her designer bag, looking like a ghost haunting a graveyard she had dug herself. I walked down the steps slowly, my new leather shoes clicking on the pavement. My driver pulled my car around the same vintage sedan I had bought back from the auction house where they had sold it. I opened the door and sat in the back seat. Diane saw me. She ran toward the car, her heels clicking frantically, her composure gone. "Harold," she cried, grabbing the door handle before I could close it. "Harold, please. I am sorry. I was lost. I was confused. We can start over. I remember the good times. Don't leave me here. I have nothing, not even a ride." I looked at her. I looked at the woman I had shared 40 years with. I looked for a spark of the girl I had married, but I saw only a stranger who had watched me sleep in a truck and eaten instant noodles without shedding a tear. I removed her hand from the door, gently but firmly. "You have your freedom, Diane," I said, my voice quiet. "That is more than you left me. I suggest you start walking. The walk will do you good. It builds character." I pulled the door shut. She tapped on the glass, sobbing, pleading, mouthing the word sorry over and over again. I looked at the driver and nodded. He put the car in gear and we rolled away. I pressed the button, and the tinted window slid up, creating a wall of black glass between me and my past. I did not look back. The next few months were a blur of reconstruction. I did not take the corner office. I did not want it. Instead, I called every single employee Greg had fired. The foreman who had been with me for 20 years. The secretary who had been forced out for being too old. The engineers who refused to cut corners. I hired them all back with a 20% raise and a full reinstatement of their benefits. I handed the daily operations to a council of these trusted workers. I told them this was their company now. I was just the landlord. I used the rent money, the $3 million from the trust, and the profits from the recovered assets to establish the Jude King Scholarship Fund. It was designed for trade schools for carpenters and welders and masons, for the people who build the world with their hands just like my grandfather did. I wanted his name to mean something again, something more than just a line on a deed. 6 months later, I sat on the porch of a small farmhouse in the hills overlooking the valley. It was my grandfather's old house. I had bought it back from the developers who were planning to tear it down, and I had restored it plank by plank using the same tools he had used. The sun was setting, turning the sky a brilliant bruised purple. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I held a cup of tea in my hands, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. I looked out over the land, the 50 acres of timber and stone that had started it all. It was quiet. It was peaceful. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I had my dignity. I had my history. And I had the silence, which was the most expensive luxury of all. I took a sip of tea and leaned back in the rocking chair, listening to the wind move through the trees. My grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in the rustling leaves. Grandfather left me more than a fortune. He left me a map. He taught me that the true measure of a man is not found in the balance of his bank account or the title on his business card. It is found in what remains when everything else is stripped away. He taught me that the greatest enemy you will ever face is not the thief who steals your wallet, or the wife who steals your heart, or the son who steals your legacy. The greatest enemy is the voice in your head that tells you that you are worthless without them. That voice is a liar. And patience. Patience is not just waiting. Patience is keeping your knife sharp while you wait. It is the ultimate weapon because time reveals all truth and time humbles all arrogance. I am Harold King. I am a carpenter. I am a father. And I am finally home. Here is a lesson we can learn from this story. True wealth is never found in the things that can be taken away from you, like money, houses, or titles, because these are temporary and fragile. Real wealth lies in your character, your resilience, and the history you carry in your blood. When you hit rock bottom, you discover who you really are, and that knowledge is a weapon that no one can steal. Be kind, but do not be weak. Be generous, but protect your boundaries. And never forget that the roots of a tree are more important than the fruit, because without the roots, the tree cannot survive the storm. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Harold was right to turn his back on his family? Or should he have given them another chance? I read every comment, and I would love to hear your perspective. Until next time, remember to keep your roots deep and your head high.